Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that sounds like science fiction, but is tragically, horrifyingly real. The rise of xylazine, better known on the streets as tranq or the zombie drug. It's a veterinary sedative so powerful it can drop a 1,500-pound horse, and now it's showing up in America's drug supply, turning users into living nightmares and baffling every doctor, cop and coroner who encounters it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your input really does shape what we cover, and it means the world. And hey, we're now live on Spotify too, so if you'd rather listen there, the link's in the description. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might think you know about the opioid crisis, fentanyl, carfentanil, all those synthetic nightmares that have been haunting America for years. But what happens when drug dealers start cutting their product with a substance never meant for humans, a veterinary tranquilizer so potent it's used to sedate rhinos and elephants? What happens when overdoses can't be reversed by Narcan? When wounds don't heal, but rot? When users' skin turns necrotic and starts falling off in chunks, earning them the nickname zombies? How did we get here? Why is this happening? And what does it mean when a horse sedative becomes the most terrifying adulterant in American drug history? So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the world outside fade away. Because tonight, we're going back to the beginning of a crisis that's still unfolding. One contaminated dose, one baffled paramedic, one unexplained death at a time. Congratulations. You've just entered the world of xylazine, and trust me, it's worse than you think. Let's start with the basics, because if you've never heard of xylazine before, you're about to get an education in veterinary pharmacology you never wanted. Xylazine is a sedative, but not just any sedative, it's an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist, which is medical speak, for this will put you to sleep hard and fast. It was approved by the FDA in 1972, but not for you, not for me, not for any human being. It was designed for animals, horses, cattle, dogs, cats, and yes, even rhinos. Veterinarians use it before surgeries to calm aggressive animals, or to sedate creatures too large and dangerous to handle awake. It works by depressing the central nervous system, slowing the heart rate, dropping blood pressure, and inducing a deep, muscle-relaxing stupor. In animals, it's predictable, controllable, and relatively safe when dosed correctly. In humans, it's a biochemical disaster waiting to happen. Think about what it takes to sedate a 1,500-pound horse. These animals are pure muscle, fight-or-flight instinct wrapped in fur and hooves. When a horse decides it doesn't want to be examined or operated on, you can't exactly reason with it over a cup of tea. You need something powerful, something that works fast, something that drops their massive nervous system into submission within minutes. That's xylazine. A single dose can take a panicked stallion from rearing and thrashing to calm and compliant in under 5 minutes. It's remarkably effective in horses. The problem is that human bodies aren't built like horse bodies. Our cardiovascular systems, our metabolic rates, our receptor distributions, all different. When veterinarians calculate xylazine doses, they're working with species-specific charts, carefully calibrated weights, and decades of research on animal physiology. They know exactly how much to give, how long it'll last, and what side effects to expect. Drug dealers measuring powder in a dingy apartment with a kitchen scale? Not so much. When xylazine enters a human bloodstream, chaos ensues. The drug doesn't know it's in the wrong species, it just does what it was designed to do. Latch onto those alpha-2 receptors and shut things down. Heart rate drops, sometimes dangerously low. Blood pressure plummets, starving organs of oxygen-rich blood. Breathing becomes shallow, laboured, barely there. And the sedation, it's not the pleasant drowsiness you get from a sleeping pill. It's a heavy, oppressive unconsciousness that feels like being buried alive in your own body. Users describe it as being trapped underwater, aware but unable to surface, drowning in slow motion. And here's the really terrifying part. There's no standard dose. When people buy heroin or fentanyl cut with xylazine on the street, they have absolutely no idea how much xylazine they're getting. It could be 5% of the mixture. It could be 50%. Some batches have almost no xylazine. Others are more tranquilizer than opioid. It's a pharmacological roulette wheel, and every hit is a gamble with death as the losing outcome. Veterinarians also have the advantage of monitoring. When they sedate an animal, they're right there watching vital signs, ready to intervene if something goes wrong. They have oxygen, IV fluids, and reversal agents standing by. Users shooting up in an alley or a bathroom stall, they've got nothing. No monitoring equipment, no medical backup, no safety net. Just them, the needle, and whatever mystery cocktail they just injected into their veins. The FDA never tested xylazine on humans because it was never meant for humans. There are no human clinical trials, no established safety profiles, no guidelines for what happens when someone accidentally or intentionally ingests it. Medical literature on xylazine poisoning in people is sparse, mostly case reports of veterinary workers who got accidentally stuck with a needle, or children who found and swallowed veterinary medications, and those cases, they're terrifying. Profound sedation, respiratory depression, cardiac, arrhythmias, sometimes coma. So when we talk about xylazine being in the drug supply, we're talking about a substance that was never, ever meant to touch human tissue, being injected directly into human veins, in unknown quantities, with zero medical oversight. It's like someone decided to experiment on humans using horse tranquilizers, except the experiment is happening millions of times a day across America, and nobody's recording the results. Just the bodies. On the streets, xylazine goes by a lot of names, and none of them sound friendly. Trank dope, zombie drug, sleep cut. In Philadelphia, where it first exploded into public consciousness, users call it trank like it's an old friend, but it's more like a demon they can't shake. The name zombie drug isn't just shock value, it's disturbingly accurate. Users who inject xylazine-laced heroin or fentanyl often end up hunched over, frozen in place for hours, swaying slightly as if caught between worlds. Their skin develops, horrifying necrotic wounds that make them look like extras from a low-budget horror film. But they're not actors. They're real people, trapped in a cycle they often don't even understand. The drug street names spread fast, whispered in alleyways, scrawled in rehab intake forms, muttered by paramedics who've seen too much. And every new name is a signal. This thing is spreading, mutating, and getting worse. Street names for drugs tell stories. They're not random. They emerge from experience, from the culture of use, from what the drug does to people. Heroin has been called smack, horse, dope for decades. Fentanyl became China White or Apache or Jackpot. Each name carries meaning, history, warning. The names for xylazine are particularly revealing. Trank is short, sharp, almost clinical. It sounds medical, which makes sense given the drug's veterinary origins. But it's also deceptively friendly, like it's just a little something to help you relax when in reality it's a sledgehammer to your nervous system. Zombie drug, though, that's where the horror really lives. Walk through Kensington in Philadelphia, or certain blocks in Baltimore, and you'll see why. People bent at impossible angles, heads drooping forward, arms hanging limp, knees locked but buckling slightly. They sway in the breeze like human-shaped weeds. Some lean against walls or cars, seemingly held up by nothing but momentum and luck. Others crouch on sidewalks in positions that would be agonizing for anyone conscious. But they're so deeply sedated they don't feel it. They don't feel anything. Time stops for them. Minutes stretch into hours. They're neither asleep nor awake, they're somewhere in between, trapped in a pharmaceutical purgatory. The zombie comparison isn't just about how they look, it's about how society treats them. In zombie movies, the zombies aren't people anymore, they're threats, monsters, things to be feared or destroyed. And that's increasingly how users of tranq are viewed, not as sick people who need help, but as walking corpses, already lost beyond saving. People cross the street to avoid them. Shop owners spray them with hoses. Police move them along like trash that needs clearing. The dehumanization is complete. The name becomes the reality. Other street names vary by region. In some areas, it's called sleep cut because it puts you to sleep, and because dealers cut their product with it. Practical, straightforward, almost boring compared to zombie drug. Some users call it tranq dope to distinguish it from regular dope. A warning encoded in the name. This stuff is different. This stuff is dangerous. Proceed with caution. But warnings only work if people have options. When you're dope sick, when withdrawal is clawing at your insides and you need relief right now, you'll take whatever's available, even if it has a terrifying nickname, even if you've seen what it does to other people. The evolution of street names also tracks the drug's spread. Early on, in Nice, Puerto Rico, and then Philadelphia, people knew exactly what they were talking about when they said tranq. It had become so prevalent that it needed its own name, separate from heroin or fentanyl. But as xylazine spread westward, users in other cities initially didn't have a name for it. They just noticed that the dope felt different, heavier, longer lasting, stranger. Eventually the names migrated too, carried by users who moved cities or by word of mouth in online forums where people discuss drugs with startling frankness. Law enforcement and medical professionals have their own terminology. They call it xylazine adulterated drugs, or XADs. Researchers refer to it as an adulterant or contaminant, clinical terms that strip away the human element. But on the streets, where language is raw and real, the names are more visceral. They describe what the drug does, how it makes you look, how it makes you feel, or rather, how it makes you not feel anything at all. Because that's what tranq does. It doesn't give you euphoria or energy or insight. It just erases you. You become a zombie, a shadow, a thing that used to be a person, and everyone who sees you knows it because they've heard the name, zombie drug, the name that tells you everything you need to know and makes you wish you didn't. So how does a horse tranquilizer end up in the heroin supply? The answer is as cynical as it is simple. Profit. Xylazine is cheap, widely available through veterinary suppliers, and in powder form it looks almost identical to heroin or fentanyl. Drug dealers began cutting their product with xylazine sometime in the early 2000s, first in Puerto Rico, then spreading to Philadelphia, then rippling outward across the eastern United States like a toxic wave. Why? Because xylazine prolongs the high. Opioids like heroin and fentanyl give users a euphoric rush, but it's short-lived. Xylazine, however, is a sedative. It makes people feel drowsy, heavy, disconnected from reality. When, mixed with opioids, it stretches out that nodding off feeling for hours. To dealers, this meant happier customers. To users, it meant a more potent, longer-lasting experience. And to everyone else, it meant the beginning of a public health nightmare no one saw coming. Let's follow the money, because that's always where these stories lead. A kilogram of pharmaceutical-grade xylazine can be purchased for a few $100s through veterinary supply companies, or, increasingly, from manufacturers overseas who don't ask too many questions. Compare that to fentanyl, which costs more to produce or import, or heroin, which requires poppy fields, refinement, and international smuggling networks. Xylazine is dirt cheap and relatively easy to obtain. For dealers working with razor-thin profit margins, constantly trying to stretch their supply to maximize sales. Xylazine is a miracle product. But it's not just about cutting costs. Xylazine actually makes the product more appealing to users, at least initially. When you mix xylazine with heroin or fentanyl, something interesting happens. The opioid provides the euphoria, that warm, floating feeling that users chase, but opioids burn through the system relatively quickly. The high peaks, plateaus, then fades, often within a few hours. Then comes withdrawal, the opposite of euphoria, a special kind of hell that makes you desperate for another dose. Xylazine changes that equation. It adds a sedative effect that lingers, that keeps you in that dreamy, half-conscious state for much longer. You nod out, drift away, and time becomes meaningless. For users, especially those trying to escape trauma, pain, or unbearable life circumstances, that extended sedation is valuable. It's oblivion in a needle. It's hours where nothing hurts. Dealers noticed this. They noticed users coming back specifically for the trank dope, asking for it by name, willing to pay a little extra. Word spread in the drug underworld. Cut your supply with xylazine, and customers will prefer your product over competitors. It was basic capitalism applied to street pharmaceuticals. Create a better product, or at least a more desirable one, and your market share grows. The supply chain is surprisingly mundane. Veterinary xylazine is sold by companies with names like Vet1, Acorn and others. It's packaged in sterile bottles, meant to be injected into animals under veterinary supervision. But those bottles can be stolen from clinics, diverted by workers with access, or simply ordered online. Some dealers connect with corrupt veterinary suppliers or techs who steal inventory. Others use the dark web to purchase bulk powder from Chinese or Indian manufacturers willing to ship anywhere, no questions asked. The packages arrive via regular mail, looking innocuous, marked as research chemicals or animal supplements. Once in dealers' hands, the xylazine powder gets mixed into whatever they're selling. There's no quality control, no standardization. One dealer might add 10% xylazine to stretch his fentanyl. Another might add 50% because he's greedy and figures more is better. Yet another might mix it unevenly, creating batches where some doses are almost pure xylazine and others barely have any. This inconsistency is part of what makes xylazine so deadly. Nobody knows what they're getting. Not the dealer's middleman, not the street-level seller, and definitely not the user. And here's the thing that makes this particularly insidious. Many users initially liked trank dope. It became a preference. People actively sought it out. They'd ask around. You got that trank? They'd test different dealers' products and return to the ones with xylazine. It wasn't until later, after the wounds started appearing, after the overdoses that Narcan couldn't touch, after friends started dying in new, horrifying ways, that the reality set in. By then, it was too late. Xylazine was everywhere, saturating the supply. You couldn't avoid it even if you wanted to. Every bag was a gamble. Every shot was Russian roulette with a horse tranquilizer. The irony is dark. A drug meant to calm frightened animals, to make veterinary care possible, to prevent suffering, has been weaponized into one of the most devastating adulterants in the American drug supply. And it happened not through some grand conspiracy, not through cartels or criminal masterminds, but through the banal logic of illegal drug markets. Find something cheap that makes your product more appealing. Cut your supply with it. Repeat until everyone's doing it. Capitalism at its ugliest. Profit over people. And the horse tranquilizer rides on. The earliest documented cases of xylazine appearing in the US drug supply date back to the early 2000s in Puerto Rico. Users started showing up in emergency rooms with strange symptoms. Extreme sedation that Narcan couldn't touch. Dangerously low blood pressure and bizarre skin wounds that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Doctors were baffled. Toxicology reports came back positive for opioids, sure, But there was something else, something they couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't until forensic chemists took a closer look that they found xylazine in the mix. At first, it was treated as a regional anomaly, a weird Puerto Rican thing that probably wouldn't spread. But by 2010, it had hopped to Philadelphia. And by 2015, it was everywhere. Boston, New York, Baltimore, spreading westward like a slow, silent plague. The early cases were tragic, but they were also warnings. Warnings that tragically went mostly unheeded. Dr. Carmen Rodriguez was one of the first physicians to sound the alarm, working in San Juan's main emergency department in 2004. She remembers the confusion vividly. Patients would arrive barely conscious, sometimes brought in by friends or family, sometimes found collapsed on the street. Standard protocol was to administer Narcan. For suspected opioid overdoses, the EMTs would push the dose. Everyone would wait for the person to gasp awake, that dramatic reversal that saved thousands of lives. Except these patients didn't wake up. They remained sedated, unresponsive, their vital signs dangerously unstable. Blood pressure so low it was barely compatible with life. Heart rates in the 40s, breathing shallow and irregular. The first few times this happened, doctors assumed they were dealing with something else entirely, maybe a stroke, maybe a brain injury, maybe some exotic toxin. It wasn't until toxicology screenings came back that patterns started emerging. Opioids were present, yes, heroin, sometimes morphine. But the clinical picture didn't match. Opioid overdoses respond to Narcan. These patients didn't. Something else was in the mix, something the standard drug panels weren't designed to detect. It took a curious forensic toxicologist, running extended screenings on a hunch, to identify xylazine in blood samples. At first, people thought it was a contamination error. Xylazine shouldn't be in human blood, it's a veterinary drug. But when it showed up again, and again, and again, the reality became unavoidable. Someone was cutting Puerto Rico's heroin supply with horse tranquilizer. Local health officials tried to respond. They issued warnings to hospitals, trained staff to recognize xylazine poisoning, and attempted to track where the contaminated drugs were coming from. But the drug trade in Puerto Rico is complex, tied to international trafficking routes and local distribution networks that are almost impossible to map comprehensively. The xylazine kept flowing, users kept overdosing, and the warnings stayed mostly local. Meanwhile, on the mainland, nobody was paying attention. Puerto Rico's health crises often get ignored by the broader US healthcare system. Colonial neglect dressed up in bureaucratic indifference. A few research papers were published in Spanish language medical journals. A few conference presentations were given to small audiences of toxicologists. But the mainstream medical community, the DEA, the CDC, none of them took serious notice. Puerto Rico's problem stayed Puerto Rico's problem until it didn't. By 2010, xylazine started appearing in Philadelphia. At first, just a few cases, users with those same weird symptoms, that same Narcan-resistant sedation, those same mysterious wounds. Philadelphia's health department had better surveillance systems than Puerto Rico, and they caught on faster. But even then, the response was slow. Xylazine wasn't a controlled substance, so law enforcement couldn't do much. It wasn't on standard drug testing panels, so tracking its prevalence was difficult. And users had no idea what they were taking, they just knew the dope felt different, lasted longer, hit harder. The early Philadelphia cases were often fatal. Users would overdose in private, alone in bathrooms or bedrooms, and by the time someone found them, hours had passed. No amount of Narcan could help at that point. The medical examiner's office started seeing a pattern. Overdose deaths where opioids were present but couldn't fully explain the cause of death. When they specifically tested for xylazine, they found it in over 30% of cases. 30%. And that was just the beginning. What's most tragic about these early cases is that they were preventable. The warning signs were there. Puerto Rico had already experienced years of xylazine contamination. Doctors there had published about it, talked about it, tried to sound the alarm. But the information didn't spread. The systems that should have connected the dots, the CDC, the DEA, state health departments, failed to act. And by the time the broader medical community realized what was happening, xylazine had already metastasized throughout the drug supply. The horse tranquilizer was out of the barn and there was no putting it back. If there's one city that knows the horrors of xylazine intimately, it's Philadelphia. By 2020, nearly a third of all drug overdose deaths in Philly involved xylazine. Walk through Kensington, the neighborhood that's become synonymous with the opioid crisis, and you'll see people slumped on sidewalks, barely conscious, skin covered in oozing wounds. It's a scene from a dystopian nightmare, except it's real, and it's happening every single day. Philadelphia became ground zero, not because users there sought out xylazine, but because dealers saturated the market with it. Users didn't even know what they were taking half the time. They thought they were buying heroin or fentanyl, and they were, but it came with a bonus ingredient that would destroy their bodies from the inside out. Health officials scrambled to respond, opening wound care clinics specifically for tranq users, distributing informational pamphlets, and training paramedics to recognize the symptoms. But it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The drug had already taken hold and it wasn't letting go. Kensington Avenue has become America's most visible open-air drug market. It's not hidden. It's not subtle. It's right there on the sidewalk in broad daylight, with hundreds of people at any given moment openly using, buying, selling, or simply existing in various states of intoxication. City officials have tried everything: sweeps, arrests, encampment clearances, increased police presence. Nothing works. The people just move a few blocks, then drift back. Because Kensington is where the drugs are, where the community is, where survival happens one day at a time. And everywhere you look in Kensington, you see the evidence of xylazine. People bent in half at the waist, heads nearly touching the ground, standing in that position for hours, a posture locals call the fentanyl fold, but is actually more accurately the tranq lean. Their bodies locked in place by the sedative affects muscles, unable to respond to the brain's weak signals to straighten up, move, do anything. They sway gently, sometimes alone, sometimes in clusters, like broken human pendulums marking time in a city that's forgotten them. Then there are the wounds. The wounds are impossible to miss. Arms wrapped in filthy bandages, legs covered in open sores, faces scarred with lesions. Some wounds are fresh, angry, red, weeping. Others are older, partially healed but clearly infected, crusted with black necrotic tissue. These aren't typical abscesses from injection drug use, though those are present too. These are xylazine wounds, and they're different. They spread. They don't heal. They rot. People walk around with chunks of their flesh literally dying on their bodies, and there's almost nowhere to go for help. The city's response, to its credit, has been more compassionate than many places. Philadelphia opened Prevention Point, a harm reduction organisation that became a lifeline for Kensington's population. They offer wound care clinics staffed by nurses who specialise in treating tranq wounds. No judgment, no questions about drug use, just basic medical care for people who desperately need it. Nurses carefully debride dead tissue, pack wounds with sterile gauze, prescribe antibiotics, and teach people how to care for their wounds between visits. They hand out clean bandages, antibiotic ointment, medical supplies, things most people take for granted but are life-saving for someone living on the streets. But even Prevention Point can only do so much. The wounds keep coming back because people keep using. Xylazine is in everything now. Users can't avoid it even if they want to. Every shot is another roll of the dice. another chance for new wounds to appear, and many users are too sick, too deep in addiction, too overwhelmed by the daily struggle of survival to keep up with wound care. Bandages get dirty or fall off, infections set in, wounds that could have healed become craters that expose bone and tendon. The city also trained its paramedics specifically for xylazine overdoses. They learned that Narcan alone wouldn't work, that they'd need to provide respiratory support, monitor vitals closely, sometimes transport people who seemed fine because the xylazine could suppress their breathing hours after the initial overdose. Fire stations started stocking more advanced medical equipment. Emergency rooms created protocols. But even with preparation, the sheer volume of cases overwhelmed the system. And then there's the human toll beyond the statistics. Families torn apart, parents burying children, children growing up watching their parents deteriorate in real time. Kensington isn't just a neighbourhood, it's a community, filled with people who have hopes and histories and loved ones. But when you walk through it, when you see the rows of people frozen in trank-induced stupors, when you smell the rot of infected wounds mixing with the smell of the street, it's hard to remember that. It's hard to see the humanity buried under so much suffering. Philadelphia's overdose death rate climbed year after year. By 2021, the city was seeing over 1,300 fatal overdoses annually. Xylazine was involved in more than 90% of them. 90%. That's not an adulterant anymore, that's the primary drug. The horse tranquilizer had become more prevalent than the heroin it was supposed to be cutting, and Philadelphia, unprepared and overwhelmed, became the poster child for a crisis that was about to swallow the entire nation. Ground Zero, the place where America's next drug nightmare was born. And Kensington Avenue, once just a neighbourhood, became a symbol of failure, the failure of policy, of compassion, of a society that looks away until it's far too late. Let's talk about the economics of despair. Xylazine costs pennies compared to fentanyl. A kilogram of xylazine powder can be purchased for a fraction of what opioids cost, often through semi-legal veterinary supply channels or sketchy online vendors. For drug dealers operating on razor-thin margins, xylazine is a godsend. It bulks up the product, extends the high, and keeps customers coming back. And because it's not an opioid, it doesn't trigger the same level of law enforcement scrutiny, at least not at first. Dealers aren't chemists, and they certainly aren't doctors. They don't care that xylazine causes tissue necrosis, that it can lead to respiratory depression, or that it makes overdoses nearly impossible to reverse. They care about one thing: profit. And if cutting their product with a horse sedative means more money in their pockets, they'll do it without a second thought. This is capitalism at its ugliest. A market where human suffering is just another externality, and the product doesn't have to be safe, it just has to sell. Understanding why dealers use xylazine requires understanding the brutal economics of street-level drug dealing. Most people imagine drug dealers as wealthy criminals, living large on their illegal profits. The reality is far grimmer. The vast majority of street dealers are themselves users, selling just enough to fund their own habits. They're not getting rich, they're surviving. Barely. They buy from mid-level suppliers, cut and repackage the product, sell it to users, and keep a small portion for themselves. Profit margins are tight, competition is fierce, and the pressure to maximize every dollar is relentless. Enter xylazine. From a dealer's perspective, it's perfect. You can buy it cheaply and easily. It's legal to possess in most places, at least it was until recently. It mixes well with powdered drugs like heroin and fentanyl, and most importantly, it improves the product. Users who try trank dope report that it lasts longer, hits harder, and provides a deeper state of sedation. In the world of illegal drug sales, where customer satisfaction determines whether you eat that week, xylazine is a competitive advantage. There's also the issue of fentanyl. Fentanyl's incredibly potent, which means even tiny amounts can be fatal. Dealers know this. They've seen customers die. They've dealt with angry friends and family members. They've lost business because word got out that their supply was killing people. Xylazine in their minds helps solve that problem. It dilutes the fentanyl, making each dose less concentrated and theoretically less likely to cause immediate overdose death. Of course, this logic is deeply flawed. Xylazine comes with its own risks, and mixing the two creates unpredictable and often deadly synergies. But dealers aren't pharmacologists. They're making decisions based on street knowledge, rumours, and desperation. Some dealers also use xylazine as a bulking agent, pure and simple. They buy a small amount of fentanyl or heroin, then stretch it by adding xylazine, sometimes at ratios of 50% or more. This lets them make more bags, sell more product, and pocket more money. The fact that their customers are injecting mostly horse tranquilizers doesn't enter the equation. In the drug trade, caveat emptor takes on a whole new meaning. Buyer beware, except the buyers have no way to know what they're actually buying. And here's where it gets even darker. Some dealers actively market tranq dope. They brand it. Users start asking for it by name. "You got that tranq?" becomes a common question. Dealers recognize that xylazine creates a distinct experience, and some users prefer it. So they lean into it, advertising their product as containing xylazine, charging a premium for it. It becomes a selling point, a feature rather than a bug. The horse tranquilizer that causes horrific wounds and Narcan-resistant overdoses becomes a sought-after ingredient. The market has spoken, and the market wants xylazine. Of course, not all dealers are callous monsters. Some genuinely don't know what they're selling. They buy pre-mixed product from suppliers and have no idea what's in it. They see the powder, it looks like dope, they assume it's dope, and they sell it as dope. Others do know but feel trapped. They're competing with dealers who use xylazine, and if they don't use it too, customers will go elsewhere. It's a race to the bottom, where the most adulterated, most dangerous product often wins, because it's the cheapest and most profitable to produce. Law enforcement's focus on opioids also gave xylazine a free pass for years. Police and DEA agents were trained to look for heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, controlled substances with clear legal consequences. Xylazine wasn't on their radar. Even if they found it during a bust, they often couldn't charge anyone for possessing it. It was like finding sugar or baby powder in a drug package. Suspicious maybe, but not illegal. This regulatory gap allowed xylazine to flood the market unchecked. The result is a perverse economic system where human suffering is just another variable in the profit equation. Dealers cut their drugs with xylazine to save money and increase sales. Users get hooked on tranq dope, developing wounds and dependencies that keep them coming back. More customers, more sales, more profit. And the cycle continues, fueled not by malice necessarily, but by the cold, indifferent logic of a black market that operates without safety regulations, quality control, or any consideration for human life. Capitalism at its ugliest indeed. A market where the invisible hand is holding a needle full of horse tranquilizer, and nobody's checking the dosage. Time for a quick chemistry lesson, because understanding why xylazine is so dangerous requires understanding how it works. Unlike opioids, which bind to opioid receptors in the brain and spinal cord, xylazine works on alpha-2 adrenergic receptors. These receptors are part of the sympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for your body's fight or flight response. When xylazine activates these receptors, it essentially tells your body to shut down. Your heart rate drops, your blood pressure plummets, your muscles relax, and your brain enters a fog of deep sedation. In animals, this is useful. In humans, it's catastrophic. There's no antidote. Narcan, the opioid overdose reversal drug that saved countless lives, does absolutely nothing for xylazine. And because xylazine is often mixed with opioids, paramedics arriving at an overdose scene face a horrifying dilemma. They can reverse the opioid part of the overdose, but the xylazine keeps the person sedated, unresponsive, and at risk of dying from respiratory failure anyway. It's a pharmacological nightmare, and it's happening on street corners across America every single day. Let's dig deeper into what makes xylazine so uniquely dangerous. The alpha-2 adrenergic receptors that xylazine targets exist throughout the central and peripheral nervous systems. When activated, they reduce the release of norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter that keeps you alert, maintains blood pressure, and regulates heart rate. Think of norepinephrine as your body's accelerator pedal. It keeps things moving, keeps you responsive to your environment. Xylazine slams on the brakes. In veterinary medicine, this is exactly what you want. A panicked horse needs to calm down before surgery. Xylazine drops its heart rate from 70 beats per minute to 30. Blood pressure falls. The horse becomes docile, manageable, safe to work with. Veterinarians monitor these vital signs closely and adjust dosing based on the animal's weight, age, and health status. They know how long the drug will last, typically 1 to 2 hours in horses, and they're prepared to support the animal's breathing and circulation if needed. Now imagine that same drug entering a human body with no medical supervision, mixed with other substances in completely unpredictable doses. The effects are immediate and severe. Heart rate drops, sometimes to dangerously low levels bradycardia that can progress to cardiac arrest. Blood pressure plummets, starving the brain and vital organs of oxygen. This is why xylazine users often appear so profoundly sedated. Their bodies are literally shutting down. The brain, deprived of adequate blood flow, can't maintain normal consciousness. People slip into a twilight state, aware but unable to respond, trapped inside bodies that won't obey. Respiratory depression is another major concern. Xylazine doesn't suppress breathing as dramatically as opioids do, but it still slows respiratory rate and depth. When combined with fentanyl or heroin, both powerful respiratory depressants, the effect is multiplicative. You've got two different drugs attacking the respiratory system through different mechanisms, and the result is someone who's barely breathing, turning blue, minutes away from death. This is where the Narcan problem becomes truly nightmarish. Narcan naloxone works by displacing opioids from their receptors. It's a competitive antagonist, meaning it competes for the same binding sites and kicks the opioid molecules off. Within minutes, opioid effects reverse. Breathing resumes, consciousness returns, lives are saved. But Narcan only works on opioid receptors. It has zero effect on alpha-2 adrenergic receptors. So when a paramedic administers Narcan to someone who's overdosed on a fentanyl-xylazine mix, they can reverse the fentanyl part. The person might start breathing better. But they remain sedated from the xylazine. Their blood pressure stays dangerously low. Their heart rate remains sluggish. They're still at risk of dying, just from a different mechanism. Paramedics describe this as one of the most frustrating aspects of the xylazine crisis. They give Narcan expecting the dramatic reversal they've seen hundreds of times, and nothing happens. Or rather, something happens. Breathing improves slightly, but the person doesn't wake up. They stay slumped, unresponsive, and the paramedics are left providing supportive care, manually assisting breathing, administering IV fluids to support blood pressure, and hoping the xylazine wears off before the person's organs shut down. The duration of xylazine's effects in humans is poorly understood because, again, it was never studied in humans. Based on veterinary data and case reports, it seems to last anywhere from 4 to 8 hours, though some users report feeling residual effects for much longer. That's an eternity when you're trying to keep someone alive. Hospital emergency departments have had patients remain deeply sedated for 12 hours or more, after a tranq overdose, requiring continuous monitoring and intervention. Some never wake up at all. There's also no reversal agent. Researchers have experimented with drugs like tolazoline or atipamezole, which are alpha-2 antagonists used in veterinary medicine to reverse xylazine in animals. But these drugs aren't approved for human use in the United States, and using them would require off-label experimentation on people who are already critically ill. The ethical and legal complications are immense, so for now, there's nothing, no antidote, no magic bullet, just supportive care and hope. The pharmacology of xylazine represents a perfect storm, a drug that causes profound sedation, cardiovascular collapse and respiratory depression, mixed with opioids that do the same things through different pathways, creating synergistic toxicity that can't be reversed by the one tool, Narcan, that saved thousands of opioid users. It's like someone designed a drug specifically to kill people in the most medically frustrating way possible, except nobody designed it. It just happened through the chaotic logic of the drug market. A horse tranquilizer became a human killer, and the chemistry doesn't care about intent. It just does what it does, receptor by receptor, heartbeat by heartbeat, until there are no heartbeats left. Here's where things get truly horrifying. One of the most distinctive and disturbing effects of xylazine use is the development of necrotic wounds, patches of skin that literally die and rot while still attached to the body. These aren't typical injection site infections. They're deep, oozing, foul-smelling ulcers that can appear anywhere on the body, not just where the drug was injected. Some users develop wounds on their arms, legs, torso, even their faces. The exact mechanism isn't fully understood, but researchers believe xylazine constricts blood vessels so severely that it cuts off oxygen to the tissue, causing it to necrotize and die. Once the tissue is dead, it becomes a breeding ground for bacteria, leading to secondary infections that can spread rapidly. Many users end up needing surgical debridement, where doctors literally cut away the dead tissue. In severe cases, amputations are necessary. And the worst part, even if users stop using xylazine, the wounds can take months or even years to heal, leaving permanent scars and disfigurement. It's a level of bodily destruction that most people associate with medieval plagues, not modern drug use. But here we are. Walk through a wound care clinic in Philadelphia, and you'll see things that will haunt you. A woman in her 30s with a wound on her thigh the size of a dinner plate, so deep you can see muscle tissue, streaked with black necrotic debris. A man in his 40s with lesions covering both forearms, the flesh grey and sloughing off in sheets. A young person, barely 20, with a wound on their neck that started as a small sore and spread until it threatened their carotid artery. These wounds are unlike anything most doctors have ever seen outside of severe burns, frostbite, or necrotizing fasciitis, the so-called flesh-eating disease. What makes xylazine wounds particularly mysterious is that they don't always appear at injection sites. That's the part that baffles researchers. If someone injects xylazine-laced heroin into their arm, you'd expect a localized reaction at that spot, and sometimes that happens. But just as often, wounds appear on the legs, the abdomen, the back, places where no injection occurred. This suggests the mechanism isn't just local trauma or contamination, it's systemic. The xylazine is circulating through the bloodstream, causing damage wherever it goes. The leading theory involves vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels. Xylazine is a powerful vasoconstrictor, meaning it makes blood vessels clamp down tight. In animals, this is part of how it works, reducing blood flow to muscles and organs to induce calm. But in humans, especially with repeated use, this vasoconstriction can become extreme. Small blood vessels, capillaries, shut down completely. The tissue they supply stops receiving oxygen. Cells begin to die. And once tissue death begins, it spreads like wildfire. Dead tissue can't fight off bacteria. Infections set in. The body tries to wall off the dead area, creating an ulcer with a blackened necrotic core surrounded by angry, inflamed living tissue desperately trying to survive. Some wounds start small, just a little discoloration or a tender spot. Users might not even notice at first, but within days the wound explodes in size. What was a dime-sized mark becomes a crater. The skin around the edges turns purple, then black. The wound begins to weep, oozing thick, foul-smelling discharge. Pain levels vary wildly. Some users report excruciating burning sensations. Others feel nothing, their nerves so damaged they're numb. And because many users are still actively using drugs, their pain perception is unreliable. They might have a massive infected wound and not seek treatment until it's far too advanced to heal easily. Treatment is agonizing and often unsuccessful. Wound care specialists carefully debride the wounds, using scalpels or specialized tools to cut away dead tissue. This has to be done repeatedly, sometimes multiple times per week, as new tissue dies faster than healthy tissue can regenerate. Patients are prescribed high-dose antibiotics to fight the secondary infections that inevitably develop. They're taught wound care, how to pack the wound with sterile gauze, how to keep it clean, how to watch for signs of worsening infection. But compliance is a challenge. People living on the streets don't have access to clean water, sterile supplies, or safe places to change bandages. Wounds get dirty, infections worsen, and the cycle continues. In extreme cases, amputation becomes the only option. When a wound on a hand or foot becomes so infected that it threatens the entire limb with sepsis, surgeons have no choice but to remove it. Young people, some still in their 20s, become amputees. They lose fingers, hands, feet, entire legs, all because of a drug they didn't even know they were taking. And even after the wounds finally heal, if they heal, the scarring is permanent and disfiguring. Some users are left with massive contractures, scar tissue so tight it restricts movement. Others have divots in their flesh, permanent indentations where chunks of tissue died and were cut away. The psychological toll is immense. People become unrecognizable to themselves. They avoid mirrors. They hide their bodies under long sleeves and pants, even in summer heat. The wounds mark them, stigmatize them, make their addiction visible in a way that's impossible to hide. Researchers are still trying to understand why xylazine causes these wounds and why some users develop them while others don't. There's likely a genetic component, differences in how individuals metabolize the drug or how their blood vessels respond to its constrictive effects. There may be cofactors, malnutrition, dehydration, other infections that make some people more vulnerable. But the answers are slow in coming, and in the meantime, the wounds keep appearing. Wound care clinics are overwhelmed. Surgeons are removing dead, tissue by the pound. And the people suffering carry the scars of xylazine not just on their bodies, but in their souls. The zombie drug doesn't just kill. Sometimes it leaves you alive, but marked forever. A walking testament to the horrors of a crisis nobody saw coming, and nobody knows how to stop. For years, Narcan has been the frontline defense against opioid overdoses. Paramedics, police officers, friends and family members carry it, knowing that a single dose can pull someone back from the brink of death. But with xylazine, Narcan is useless. Here's why. Narcan works by blocking opioid receptors in the brain, essentially kicking opioids off those receptors and reversing their effects. But xylazine doesn't bind to opioid receptors, it binds to completely different receptors in a completely different system. So when paramedics administer Narcan to someone who's overdosed on a xylazine fentanyl mix, they can reverse the fentanyl part, but the xylazine keeps the person sedated, unresponsive, and at risk of dying from respiratory depression. It's like trying to unlock a door with the wrong key. the lock doesn't budge, and the person doesn't wake up. This has created a terrifying new reality for first responders. They can no longer rely on the one tool that saved thousands of lives. They're forced to provide supportive care, breathing assistance, IV fluids, monitoring, and hope the person survives long enough for the xylazine to wear off naturally. It's a slow, agonizing process, and not everyone makes it. Paramedic Jake Morrison has been working in Philadelphia for 8 years. He's administered Narcan hundreds of times and watched people come back from the edge of death with almost miraculous speed. It's the best feeling in the world, he says. Someone's blue, not breathing, and you give them Narcan, and within 2 minutes they're gasping, coughing, coming back. They're usually pissed off because you've ruined their high, but they're alive. That's what matters. But in the past few years, Jake has watched that miracle fail more and more often. Now we show up to an overdose and we do everything right. We give Narcan, sometimes 2 doses, 3 doses, more, and nothing happens. The person's still out, still barely breathing, and we realise it's tranq, and there's nothing we can do except bag them and pray. Bagging means manually assisting breathing using a bag valve mask, essentially breathing for the person until their body can take over again. It's labour-intensive, exhausting, and uncertain. You're buying time, hoping the xylazine metabolizes and clears the system before irreversible damage occurs. The failure of Narcan represents a fundamental shift in how overdoses work. For decades, the opioid overdose playbook was simple. Recognize the signs, unconsciousness, pinpoint pupils, slow or absent breathing, administer Narcan, monitor the person, transport if necessary. Narcan worked so reliably that it became a cornerstone of harm reduction. Naloxone kits were distributed to users, families, community organizations. People were trained to recognize overdoses and respond. Lives were saved by the thousands. The drug was so safe and effective that many states passed laws allowing anyone to carry and administer it without fear of prosecution. But xylazine has thrown that entire system into chaos. First responders arrive at overdose scenes and face agonizing uncertainty. Is this an opioid overdose? A xylazine overdose? A combination? They give Narcan because, well, what else can they do? Sometimes it helps a little. The person starts breathing slightly better if there's fentanyl involved. But they don't wake up. They remain unconscious, sometimes for hours, their bodies in a pharmacological limbo that no medication can reverse. This has created psychological trauma for first responders. Jake describes the helplessness. You train your whole career to save people. You have tools, protocols, medications, but with tranq, we're back to basics. Airway, breathing, circulation, and sometimes it's not enough. You do everything right and people still die. That eats at you. You start questioning yourself. Did I miss something? Could I have done more? But the truth is, there's just nothing else to do. The antidote doesn't exist. The Narcan failure also affects user behavior in complicated ways. Some users have stopped carrying Narcan because they believe it doesn't work anymore. That's not entirely true. It still works for pure opioid overdoses, but the perception is spreading. Others have become paranoid about calling for help, fearing that paramedics won't be able to save them anyway. This delays emergency response, worsening outcomes. And tragically, some users have died alone because their friends assumed Narcan would work and didn't call 911 until it was too late. Researchers are desperately trying to find a solution. Some have proposed using tolazoline or atipamezole, veterinary drugs, that reverse xylazine in animals by blocking alpha-2 receptors. Early case reports from veterinary medicine show these drugs can reverse xylazine sedation in dogs and horses within minutes. But in humans, the drugs are untested and potentially dangerous. The FDA would need to approve their use, clinical trials would need to be conducted, and even then there's no guarantee they'd work the same way in humans as they do in animals. Years could pass before a xylazine reversal agent becomes available, if one ever does. In the meantime, harm reduction organizations are adapting. They're teaching users to recognize xylazine overdoses, which look slightly different from pure opioid overdoses. Slower breathing rather than no breathing, sometimes snoring sounds, extreme pallor, dangerously low blood pressure if you can check it. They're emphasizing the importance of calling 911 immediately, not waiting to see if Narcan works. They're distributing pulse oximeters and blood pressure, cuffs to community members, turning drug users into quasi-paramedics capable of monitoring vital signs and making life or death decisions. But none of this changes the fundamental problem. Narcan doesn't work on xylazine. The miracle drug has met its match. And until a reversal agent exists, every xylazine overdose is a race against time, a desperate attempt to keep someone alive long enough for their body to metabolize the drug naturally. Sometimes the body wins, sometimes it doesn't. And first responders like Jake are left standing over bodies holding empty Narcan vials, knowing they did everything they could and it still wasn't enough. The wrong key for a lock that keeps killing people. That's the Narcan problem. And nobody knows how to solve it. What started in Puerto Rico and exploded in Philadelphia didn't stay contained. By 2022, xylazine had been detected in drug samples across 48 states. The Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions saw the highest concentrations, but it was spreading westward, showing up in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Seattle. The CDC began tracking it. The DEA issued warnings, but the drug was already embedded in the supply chain, mixed into heroin, fentanyl, and even cocaine. Users had no way of knowing if their drugs contained xylazine unless they tested them, and most didn't. Harm reduction organizations scrambled to distribute fentanyl test strips and xylazine test strips, but the strips were expensive, hard to find, and not foolproof. Meanwhile, overdose deaths involving xylazine skyrocketed. In some regions, xylazine was involved in more than half of all fatal overdoses. It wasn't just an East Coast problem anymore, it was everywhere, a silent epidemic within an epidemic, and no one seemed to know how to stop it. The spread of xylazine followed drug trafficking routes with eerie precision. From Puerto Rico, it hopped to Miami, then up the eastern seaboard. Philadelphia became the epicenter, but New York, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Boston all saw rapid increases. By 2018, xylazine was detected in drug samples throughout New England. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, states that were already struggling with opioid epidemics suddenly faced a new, more dangerous threat. Then it jumped the Appalachians. Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Rust Belt states devastated by decades of economic decline and opioid saturation became the next battleground. Rural communities that had never heard of xylazine suddenly found themselves dealing with it. Small-town coroners who barely had the resources to test for fentanyl now had to learn about veterinary sedatives. The learning curve was steep, and people died while officials caught up. By 2020, xylazine had reached the Midwest. Chicago saw its first confirmed xylazine deaths, then Indianapolis, then St. Louis. The drug moved along interstate highways, carried by traffickers who saw an opportunity. Xylazine was cheap, effective, and largely unregulated. Why not expand the market? The Midwest drug supply, which had already transitioned from prescription pills to heroin to fentanyl over the preceding decade, absorbed xylazine without much resistance. Dealers mixed it in, users bought it unknowingly, and the bodies started piling up. The West Coast was slower to see xylazine's arrival, but by 2021 it was there too. Los Angeles County detected xylazine in 10% of tested drug samples. San Francisco's Tenderloin District, already ground zero for the West Coast opioid crisis, began seeing characteristic xylazine wounds and Narcan-resistant overdoses. Seattle, Portland, San Diego, major cities up and down the coast, all reported cases. The Pacific Northwest, with its established drug trafficking infrastructure connecting to Mexican cartels, became a new frontier for xylazine. Even rural America wasn't spared. Small towns in Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, places where people thought they were isolated from big city drug problems, found xylazine in their local supplies. A teenager in rural Tennessee overdoses on what they thought was heroin. A construction worker in Idaho injects fentanyl cut with xylazine and develops wounds that his local clinic has never seen before. The crisis was no longer urban, it was everywhere. The CDC's tracking data painted a grim picture. In 2019, xylazine was detected in approximately 2% of drug overdose deaths nationwide. By 2021, that number had jumped to nearly 20% in some states, and in the hardest hit areas, Philadelphia, surrounding counties in Pennsylvania, parts of Maryland, xylazine was present in over 90% of fatal overdoses involving opioids. 90%. The adulterant had become the norm. International spread began too. Canada saw its first xylazine cases in Ontario and British Columbia in 2020. Mexican authorities detected it in drug samples seized at the border. European drug monitoring agencies issued alerts after finding xylazine in Spain and the United Kingdom. The drug was going global, following the same routes that fentanyl had taken years earlier. What made the spread so difficult to combat was the invisibility of xylazine in the supply chain. Unlike heroin or fentanyl, which are controlled substances that law enforcement actively targets, xylazine flew under the radar. Standard drug testing didn't detect it. Police could seize a bag of powder, test it, find fentanyl and make an arrest, never knowing the bag was half xylazine. Even toxicology tests on overdose victims initially missed it unless specifically requested. By the time health departments realized how prevalent xylazine had become, it was already everywhere. Harm reduction groups tried to respond, distributing xylazine test strips alongside fentanyl strips. But the strips had limitations. They required dissolving a small sample of the drug, waiting several minutes, and interpreting results. In the chaos of street drug use, people who are already sick, desperate, and not thinking about testing, that extra step often didn't happen. And even when people did test and found xylazine, what were their options? Stop using and face brutal withdrawal? Try to find a dealer who didn't cut with xylazine? The strips provided information, but information without alternatives is just anxiety. By 2023, the map of America's xylazine crisis looked like a spreading stain, darkest in the northeast, bleeding outward across the entire country. Only Alaska and Hawaii seemed relatively untouched, and even there sporadic cases had been reported. The horse tranquilizer had conquered the nation, and the conquest had happened so quietly that most Americans didn't even know there was a war being fought. A silent epidemic within an epidemic, spreading one contaminated dose at a time, and by the time anyone noticed it was already too late to contain it. The term zombie drug isn't just media sensationalism, it's a chillingly accurate description of what xylazine does to people. Walk through certain neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Baltimore, or New York, and you'll see them. People slumped over at impossible angles, swaying slightly, eyes half open but unseeing, limbs bent awkwardly as if their bones have gone soft. They're not dead, but they're not quite alive either. They're trapped in a twilight state of sedation, so profound that they lose all sense of time, place and self. Some stay frozen like this for hours, oblivious to the world around them. Cars honk, people walk by, rain falls, they don't move, and when they finally do wake up, they often have no memory of what happened. It's a disturbing, dehumanizing spectacle, one that's become so common in some cities that passers-by barely glance at the huddled figures anymore. But behind each frozen body is a person, someone's child, sibling, parent, friend, someone who didn't choose to become a zombie, They just chose to use drugs, and the drugs chose to destroy them. The posture is what strikes you first. Bodies bent forward at the waist, nearly folded in half, heads hanging so low they're almost touching the ground. Sometimes they're standing, sometimes sitting, sometimes in positions that seem to defy physics, leaning against nothing, balanced on one leg, arms extended at bizarre angles. They look like broken mannequins, like people who started to sit down and froze mid-motion. Locals call it the trank lean or the fentanyl fold, though it's mostly the xylazine causing it. The drug's sedative effects are so powerful that the brain loses control over the body's postural muscles. The person is conscious, sort of, but unable to coordinate movement. They're trapped inside a body that won't respond to commands. Time becomes meaningless in the trank state. Users report that hours feel like minutes, or minutes feel like hours, or time simply stops existing as a concept. One user described it as being underwater, trying to swim to the surface, but the surface keeps moving away. Another said it felt like watching yourself from far away, knowing you should move but having no idea how. The dissociation is profound. You're there, but not there. Present, but absent. Alive, but not living. And the zombies are everywhere. On Kensington Avenue you can count dozens at any given time, a row of bent figures lining the sidewalk like human sculptures in some dystopian art installation. Near homeless encampments in San Francisco's Tenderloin, people sway in small clusters, some propped against each other, forming human tripods that somehow stay upright through pure momentum. In Baltimore's alleyways, solitary figures stand frozen in the shadows, so still that you might mistake them for statues until you see the slight rhythmic sway, the shallow rise and fall of breathing. The visual impact is devastating. It's one thing to understand intellectually that there's a drug crisis. It's another to see it embodied in human forms that look like they've been paused mid-existence. Tourists stumble upon these scenes and are horrified. Children ask their parents what's wrong with those people. News crews film them, and the footage goes viral. Rows of zombies, bent and broken, swaying in unison like some macabre dance. The images are powerful, shocking, impossible to ignore. They force society to confront the crisis in a way that statistics never could. But the zombie phenomenon does something else too. It dehumanizes. When you call someone a zombie, when you film them in their most vulnerable moment and share it online, when you walk past them without seeing the person underneath the posture, you're participating in their erasure. These aren't zombies. They're human beings experiencing severe drug-induced sedation. They're people with names, histories, families. They're someone's daughter who dreamed of being a teacher, someone's son who loved basketball, someone's parent who used to read bedtime stories. The drugs have stolen their dignity, but society doesn't need to finish the job. And yet the term persists because it's visceral, memorable, and uncomfortably accurate. People do look like zombies, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the horror of the term forces us to pay attention in a way that clinical language doesn't. Xylazine-induced severe sedation doesn't carry the same weight as zombie drug. It doesn't convey the visual nightmare, the human tragedy, the sheer wrongness of seeing people frozen in place on city streets while life continues around them. Some users who've experienced the trankline describe it as the scariest high they've ever had. Not because it hurt, many report feeling nothing at all, but because of the loss of control. They'd dose, then suddenly wake up hours later in a completely different location, with no memory of how they got there. They'd find bruises, cuts, wounds they couldn't explain. One woman woke up with a broken wrist and no idea how it happened. A man came to standing in the middle of traffic, cars swerving around him. The zombie state isn't restful or pleasant. It's a void, a blank space where consciousness should be. And the wounds, always the wounds. When you're frozen in one position for hours, blood flow becomes restricted. Combine that with xylazine's vasoconstricting effects, And you've got a recipe for tissue damage. People stand in the same spot so long that their feet develop sores. They lean against rough walls and wake up with abrasions that become infected. The zombie posture itself contributes to the necrotic wounds that define xylazine use. The phenomenon has become a public health marker. When a city starts seeing the zombie lean on its streets, officials know xylazine has arrived. It's a visual epidemic, a crisis you can see from your car window. And once it takes hold, it's nearly impossible to reverse. The zombies multiply. They congregate in certain areas, creating zones where dozens of people sway simultaneously, a forest of bent figures moving to a rhythm only the drug understands. Welcome to the zombie apocalypse. Except the zombies didn't come from a virus or a bite, they came from a needle, and the horse tranquilizer that created them is still flowing through America's veins, one contaminated dose at a time. When xylazine first started appearing in toxicology reports, doctors were confused. Veterinary sedatives weren't supposed to be in human drug supplies. But as cases mounted, the medical community had to adapt. Fast. Hospitals in hard-hit areas began developing xylazine-specific treatment protocols. Emergency rooms trained staff to recognize the symptoms. Extreme sedation unresponsive to Narcan, dangerously low blood pressure, bradycardia, and those horrifying necrotic wounds. Wound care clinics sprouted up in cities like Philadelphia, staffed by nurses and doctors who specialized in treating tranq-related ulcers. They performed debridements, prescribed antibiotics, and taught users how to care for their wounds to prevent further infection. But it was an uphill battle. Many users couldn't afford treatment, didn't have insurance, or were too ashamed to seek help. And even when they did, the wounds often returned as soon as they used again. The medical community did what it could, but it was clear that this wasn't a problem that could be solved with bandages and antibiotics alone. It required systemic change, and that was nowhere in sight. Dr. Sarah Chen remembers the first time she saw a xylazine wound. It was 2019, and she was working in the emergency department at Temple University Hospital in Philadelphia. A woman in her mid-30s came in complaining of an infection on her leg. When Dr. Chen removed the dirty bandage, she found a wound unlike anything in her medical training. It was massive, maybe 4 inches across and deep. You could see muscle, maybe even bone. The edges were black and necrotic. And the smell. She pauses, choosing words carefully. It smelled like death, like rotting meat. I'd seen abscesses, cellulitis, infected injection sites. This was different. This was tissue that had died and was decomposing while still attached to a living person. That first patient taught Dr. Chen and her colleagues that they were dealing with something new. Standard treatment for injection-related infections, antibiotics, drainage, maybe minor debridement, wasn't enough. These wounds required aggressive surgical intervention, repeated cleanings, prolonged antibiotic courses, and intensive wound care that most emergency departments weren't equipped to provide. So hospitals adapted. Temple created a specialized wound care clinic specifically for tranq users. Other hospitals followed suit. Jefferson, Penn Presbyterian, Einstein all developed protocols. The protocol started with triage. When someone presented with a suspected xylazine wound, nurses would document the size, depth, and location. Photographs were taken for medical records and to track healing progress. Then came debridement, the process of cutting away dead tissue. This had to be done carefully, and often required multiple sessions. Dead tissue doesn't bleed, so surgeons could identify the border between living and dead flesh by watching for bleeding. Everything that didn't bleed got cut away. The procedures were painful, even with local anesthesia, because the wounds often extended deeper than expected. After debridement, the wounds required daily care. Nurses taught patients to pack the wounds with sterile gauze soaked in saline or antimicrobial solution. The gauze has to be changed at least once daily, sometimes multiple times if the wound was particularly large or infected. Oral antibiotics were prescribed, usually broad spectrum to cover the variety of bacteria that colonize the wounds. And patients were instructed to watch for warning signs: increased redness, spreading warmth, fever, red streaks extending from the wound, all signs of potentially life-threatening infections spreading through the bloodstream. But compliance was a constant struggle. Many patients were homeless, or living in conditions where maintaining sterile wound care was impossible. How do you keep a wound clean when you're sleeping in an alley? Where do you find clean water to wash your hands before changing a bandage? How do you remember to take antibiotics 4 times a day when you're focused on finding your next dose to stave off withdrawal? The medical interventions, no matter how well designed, collided with the harsh realities of addiction and homelessness. Some hospitals went further, creating integrated care programs. These programs offered wound care, addiction treatment, mental health services, and social support all in one place. The theory was sound: treat the whole person, not just the wound. But funding was limited, wait lists were long, and many patients cycled in and out of treatment, unable to maintain stability long enough for their wounds to heal. Nurses became the unsung heroes of the xylazine response. They spent hours with patients, carefully cleaning wounds, teaching care techniques, offering encouragement. Many developed deep relationships with their patients, recognizing them by name when they returned for follow-up appointments or showed up in the ER with new wounds. The nurses saw the humanity in people that society had written off. They saw the intelligence, the humor, the resilience. They also saw the tragedy, watching young people lose limbs, seeing the same faces return week after week with wounds that wouldn't heal, knowing that without addressing the underlying addiction, they were just putting bandages on a hemorrhage. The medical literature slowly caught up. Case reports appeared in emergency medicine journals. Researchers published studies on wound characteristics, treatment outcomes, and best practices. Medical conferences began, including sessions on xylazine wound management. What had been a mystery in 2019 had become, by 2023, a recognized medical entity with published guidelines. But knowledge didn't translate to resources. Many hospitals still lacked specialized wound care clinics. Many regions had no providers trained in xylazine wound treatment. And in rural areas, doctors were often encountering xylazine wounds for the first time, with no institutional knowledge to draw on. The response also revealed systemic failures. Health insurance often didn't cover prolonged wound care or the expensive medications needed to treat severe infections. Medicaid reimbursement rates were so low that many wound care specialists refused to accept Medicaid patients, leaving the poorest and most vulnerable without access to care. And the stigma, always the stigma, meant that even when treatment was available, patients faced judgment, dismissal, and sometimes outright hostility from healthcare providers who saw addiction as a moral failing rather than a disease. So the medical community responded yes. They created protocols, opened clinics, published research. But they did so within a system that was never designed to handle a crisis like xylazine. A system that treats symptoms but rarely addresses root causes. A system that can debride a wound but can't house a homeless person. That can prescribe antibiotics but can't provide addiction treatment on demand. The doctors and nurses did what they could with what they had, but it was never enough. It was never going to be enough, because you can't bandage your way out of a drug epidemic, and the wounds just kept coming. Xylazine doesn't just destroy the body, it ravages the mind. Users report profound psychological effects: dissociation, paranoia, intense anxiety, and a feeling of being not quite there. Some describe it as being trapped inside their own body, aware but unable to move or speak. Others say it feels like drowning in slow motion, sinking deeper and deeper into a fog they can't escape. The drug's sedative properties make it nearly impossible to function. Users miss work, lose jobs, abandon relationships, and drift further into isolation. And because xylazine prolongs the high, it's incredibly difficult to quit. Users become dependent not just on the opioid component, but on the sedation itself. Withdrawal from xylazine is brutal. Severe anxiety, agitation, tremors, and a sense of existential dread that can last for weeks. Unlike opioid withdrawal, which is miserable but not life-threatening, xylazine withdrawal can cause dangerous spikes in blood pressure and heart rate. Many users try to quit, fail, and return to using just to escape the unbearable discomfort. It's a cycle of despair, and xylazine is the anchor dragging them down. Marcus sits in a recovery centre in Baltimore, 2 months clean from tranq dope, and describes what it did to his mind. It's like you're living in a dream, but not a good dream. Everything feels distant and unreal. I'd be talking to someone, and it was like I was watching myself talk from across the room. I couldn't connect, couldn't feel anything. My girlfriend would be crying, telling me I was killing myself, and I'd just nothing. No emotion, just this dead, empty feeling. He rubs his arms, covered in scars from old wounds. The scary part was that I started preferring it. The numbness, I mean. Reality was too hard, too sharp. Tranq made everything soft and blurry. It was easier to not feel. This dissociation is one of xylazine's most insidious effects. The drug doesn't just sedate the body, it separates consciousness from experience. Users report feeling like they're watching their lives happen to someone else, like they're passengers in their own bodies with no control over where they're going. Psychologists call it depersonalization, a state where your sense of self becomes fragmented and unreal. For people already dealing with trauma, and most chronic drug users have extensive trauma histories, this dissociation can be simultaneously terrifying and addictive. It's the ultimate escape, a pharmaceutical erasure of selfhood. The paranoia comes in waves. Users describe feeling watched, followed, convinced that something terrible is about to happen, but unable to articulate what. Some develop full-blown delusions during or after tranq use. One woman became convinced her skin was infested with parasites and scratched herself bloody trying to dig them out, a condition called formication, common with certain drugs, but particularly severe with xylazine fentanyl combinations. Others report auditory hallucinations, hearing voices or sounds that aren't there, especially during the long, confused twilight of the tranq high. The anxiety is perhaps the worst part, according to many users. Not during the high you feel nothing, which is kind of the point. But as the drug wears off, as consciousness begins to return, a crushing wave of anxiety arrives with it. Heart pounding, breath short, a sense of impending doom so intense that users describe it as the worst panic attack of their lives, recurring every single time the drug wears off. This creates a vicious cycle. Used to escape anxiety, experience intense anxiety during come down, use again to escape that anxiety. The drug creates the very problem it claims to solve. Functioning becomes impossible. Xylazine's sedative effects last for hours, sometimes most of a day. Users can't hold jobs because they're either too sedated to work or too anxious during withdrawal to function. They miss appointments, forget commitments, lose track of time entirely. One user described losing 3 days. She dosed on Monday morning and regained full awareness Thursday afternoon, with only fragmentary memories of the intervening time. She'd moved locations, had conversations she couldn't recall, and apparently injured herself badly enough to need stitches, though she had no memory of the injury or the hospital visit. Relationships deteriorate rapidly. Partners, family members, friends, they watch the person they love disappear into a tranq-induced fog and not come back. Not really. Even when physically present, tranq users are mentally absent. They miss birthdays, forget promises, fail to show up for their children. The drugs steal not just their presence, but their ability to connect, to love, to be human in any meaningful sense. Many users report that the guilt and shame over these failures becomes unbearable, which of course drives them deeper into use. It's a perfect trap. And then there's the dependency itself. Opioid addiction is well understood. The brain's reward pathways get hijacked, tolerance develops, withdrawal is hell. But xylazine adds a new layer. Users become psychologically dependent on the dissociation, on the erasure of consciousness. They crave not just the absence of pain, but the absence of self. Therapists working with tranq users report that traditional addiction treatment models don't quite fit. You can't just substitute methadone or buprenorphine and expect success, because those medications address opioid dependency but do nothing for xylazine. Withdrawal is its own nightmare. Opioid withdrawal is famously awful: flu-like symptoms, muscle aches, insomnia, anxiety, and intense cravings that can last weeks. But it doesn't typically kill you, though it can feel like it might. Xylazine withdrawal, however, can be medically dangerous. Blood pressure spikes, heart rate becomes irregular. Some users experience seizures. The psychological symptoms, anxiety, panic, insomnia, irritability, are often more severe than opioid withdrawal alone. And because most users are withdrawing from both opioids and xylazine simultaneously, they're hit with a double whammy of physical and psychological torture. Treatment programs are only beginning to understand how to help. Some facilities use clonidine, a blood pressure medication that works on similar receptors and can ease some withdrawal symptoms. Others focus on intensive psychological support, therapy, and medication management. But success rates remain low. Many users relapse within days or weeks, unable to tolerate the psychological discomfort of early recovery. And when they relapse, they often go straight back to tranq dope, because now their brain has learned to crave not just opioids, but that specific combination of opioid euphoria and xylazine dissociation. Marcus, 2 months clean, still struggles. Every day I wake up and I want to use. Not because I feel bad exactly, but because I miss not feeling. Does that make sense? I miss the fog. Reality is sharp and it hurts, and tranq made it soft. Learning to live without that softness, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. He's one of the lucky ones. He has housing, a treatment program, a supportive family. Most tranq users don't. Most are trying to withdraw on the streets, in shelters, in environments where the drug is everywhere and support is nowhere. The psychological toll of xylazine isn't just in the using, it's in the quitting too. The drug takes your mind hostage and doesn't let go easily. Some people never escape, and the ones who do carry the scars forever. For cops and DEA agents, xylazine presents a unique challenge. It's not a controlled substance. At least, it wasn't for a long time. It's a veterinary drug, legally available for legitimate purposes. That meant dealers could order it online, have it shipped to their doorsteps, and face no legal consequences. Even when authorities caught dealers with xylazine, they couldn't always prosecute them for it. The laws hadn't caught up to the reality on the streets. By 2023, the DEA finally classified xylazine as an emerging threat, and some states began scheduling it as a controlled substance. But enforcement remained patchy and inconsistent. Meanwhile, dealers adapted. They switched suppliers, used encrypted messaging apps, and found new ways to evade detection. It was a game of cat and mouse, and the mouse was winning. Law enforcement could bust individual dealers, seize shipments, and make arrests, but the supply kept flowing. Because as long as there was demand, and there was plenty of demand, someone would find a way to meet it. Detective Ray Torres has worked narcotics in Philadelphia for 12 years. He's seen the drug trade evolve from prescription pills to heroin to fentanyl, each wave bringing new challenges. But xylazine, he says, is different. We'd bust a dealer, search the place, find bags of powder. We'd test it, positive for fentanyl, so we charge them with possession with intent to distribute fentanyl. But we wouldn't test for xylazine because it wasn't illegal. Even if we knew it was probably cut with tranq, we had no legal grounds to charge for that. So the dealer gets prosecuted for the fentanyl, serves some time if we're lucky, gets out and goes right back to selling the same tranq-cut garbage. We were fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. The legal framework simply wasn't designed for this. The Controlled Substances Act, which governs drug enforcement in the US, categorizes drugs into schedules based on their medical use and abuse potential. Xylazine had a legitimate medical use in veterinary medicine, so it wasn't scheduled. It existed in a regulatory grey zone, overseen by the FDA as a prescription animal medication but not classified as a controlled substance. This meant that possessing xylazine wasn't a crime. Selling it wasn't a crime, unless you were practicing veterinary medicine without a license, which is a very different and much harder to prosecute offence. Dealers exploited this gap aggressively. Some set up fake veterinary supply companies to order bulk xylazine legally. Others purchased from overseas suppliers who shipped directly to US addresses, often mislabeling the packages as research chemicals or laboratory supplies. Customs officials had no reason to seize these packages. Xylazine wasn't on their watch lists. It slipped through by the ton. Even when police knew dealers were cutting drugs with xylazine, their hands were tied. You can't get a search warrant based on suspected xylazine possession, because it's not illegal. You can't charge someone with distribution because, again, it's not a controlled substance. The legal system was built to handle cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, classic illegal drugs. It wasn't built for a scenario where illegal veterinary medication becomes a lethal adulterant in the illegal drug supply. The DEA designation of xylazine as an emerging threat in 2023 was a step forward, but it didn't automatically make the drug illegal. It authorized the DEA to monitor it more closely, track its prevalence, and coordinate responses. But prosecution still required state-level action. Some states moved quickly. Pennsylvania, where the crisis was worst, proposed legislation to schedule xylazine as a controlled substance. Other states followed. But the legislative process is slow, and in the meantime, xylazine kept flowing. There's also the problem of testing. Standard field tests used by police don't detect xylazine. When cops seize a bag of powder on the street, they use reagent tests that change colour to indicate the presence of specific drugs. These tests work for cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. They don't work for xylazine, so police might seize a bag that's 50% xylazine, test it, find fentanyl, and assume they've identified the entire threat. The xylazine goes unnoticed, unrecorded, and unprosecuted. Even in lab analysis, xylazine required specific testing. Standard toxicology panels don't include it. Crime labs had to add xylazine to their testing protocols, which required new equipment, new training, and new funding, all in chronically underfunded systems, already struggling to keep up with fentanyl cases. Some jurisdictions still don't test for xylazine routinely, meaning the true prevalence is almost certainly higher than official statistics suggest. Dealers adapted in other ways too. As law enforcement began cracking down on veterinary supply chains, dealers shifted to synthesis. Unlike fentanyl, which requires significant chemical expertise to produce, xylazine is relatively simple to synthesize. Clandestine labs in Mexico and China began producing xylazine specifically for the US drug market. These labs operated outside any regulatory framework, producing powder of wildly varying purity and potency. Some batches were nearly pure xylazine, others were barely 10%. This inconsistency made the drug even more dangerous. international cooperation became critical. The DEA worked with Mexican authorities to shut down labs and interdict shipments. But for every lab raided, 2 more popped up. The profit margins were just too good. A lab could produce a kilogram of xylazine for a few $100s and sell it for thousands to US dealers. The economics made enforcement almost futile. Detective Torres describes the frustration. We arrest dealers, we seize drugs, we put people in prison, and nothing changes. The supply is endless. Users keep dying, and we're stuck playing whack-a-mole, hitting one dealer while 10 more are already operating. The war on drugs approach doesn't work with xylazine. It didn't work with anything else, and it definitely doesn't work here. But we don't have another playbook, so we keep doing the same thing, hoping for different results, which is basically the definition of insanity. Some law enforcement officials began advocating for different approaches. Focus on treatment, not incarceration. Target the big suppliers, not street-level dealers. Invest in harm reduction. These ideas met resistance from traditionalists who believe tough-on-crime policies work despite decades of evidence. To the contrary. The debate continues, and in the meantime, xylazine flows unabated. By the time laws catch up, by the time testing becomes routine, by the time prosecution becomes effective, the drug has already moved on, evolved, found new supply chains. Law enforcement is always chasing yesterday's crisis, and xylazine, like water, flows through every gap in the system. The mouse isn't just winning, it's not even being chased effectively. And people keep dying while legislators debate and cops arrest low-level dealers who are replaced within hours. The dilemma isn't just legal, it's existential. Can law enforcement even solve this problem? And if not, what do we do instead? In the face of a crisis that seemed unstoppable, harm reduction organizations stepped up. These groups, often underfunded, understaffed, and operating on the fringes of legality, became the frontline warriors against xylazine. They distributed test strips so users could check their drugs for xylazine and fentanyl. They handed out clean needles, wound care supplies, and Narcan, even though Narcan couldn't reverse xylazine overdoses. They opened safe injection sites where users could consume drugs under medical supervision, reducing the risk of fatal overdoses. And they educated users about the dangers of xylazine, how to recognize it, how to use more safely, and when to seek medical help. Critics argued that harm reduction enabled drug use. Supporters countered that it saved lives. And the data back them up. Cities with robust harm reduction programs saw fewer overdose deaths, fewer HIV and hepatitis C infections, and more people eventually entering treatment. But funding was always a problem. Politicians were reluctant to support programs that didn't demand abstinence, and many harm reduction groups survived on shoestring budgets and volunteer labour. They did what they could with what they had, and it was never enough. But it was something. And in a crisis this dark, something was better than nothing. Prevention Point. Philadelphia sits on a gritty corner in Kensington, a storefront with security gates and a simple sign. Inside, it's bustling. People lined up at a window to exchange used syringes for clean ones, others waiting for wound care appointments, a few sitting in a side room talking with peer counsellors. The organisation operates on the principle that people who use drugs deserve dignity, respect, and healthcare, regardless of whether they're ready to quit. The staff doesn't judge, they don't lecture, they don't demand abstinence as a condition for services. They meet people where they are, which right now is deep in active addiction, struggling to survive day to day. This philosophy, called harm reduction, is controversial because it challenges the abstinence-only model that's dominated American drug policy for decades. To critics, harm reduction enables drug use, sends the wrong message, gives up on people who need tough love. To supporters, it's the only approach grounded in reality and compassion. The numbers tell a clear story. Cities with syringe exchange programs see dramatic reductions in HIV and hepatitis C transmission among people who inject drugs. Studies show that providing clean needles doesn't increase drug use. People aren't shooting up because they got a free needle. They're shooting up because they're addicted, and without clean needles, they're sharing, reusing, and spreading blood-borne diseases. Harm reduction prevents that. It's public health 101, except politics make it controversial. When xylazine arrived, harm reduction organisations were among the first to respond. They started hearing from users, "The dope's different. It lasts longer. People are getting weird wounds." Staff paid attention. They collected samples for testing, documenting the presence of xylazine before most health departments even knew to look for it, and they adapted their services. Prevention Point began stocking specialised wound care supplies, sterile gauze, antibiotic ointment, medical tape, and training staff to provide basic wound care. Nurses volunteered to run wound care clinics, teaching users how to clean and dress their injuries. Test strips became critical. Fentanyl test strips had been around for a few years, allowing users to check if their drugs contained fentanyl before using. When xylazine test strips became available, harm reduction groups distributed them widely. The strips weren't perfect. They sometimes gave false negatives, and they required users to dissolve a small sample of their drugs in water, which not everyone did. But they provided information, and information saves lives. The educational component was equally important. Harm reduction workers, many of them people in recovery who'd used drugs themselves, talked to active users about xylazine. They explained what it was, why it was dangerous, and how to reduce risks. Use with someone present. Start with a small test dose. Call 911 if someone overdoses, even if Narcan doesn't seem to work. Keep wounds clean. Seek medical care early before infection spread. This information, delivered without judgment by people users trusted, got through in ways that doctors' lectures or police warnings never could. Safe injection sites, technically called supervised consumption facilities, represented the cutting edge of harm reduction. In these sites, users could inject drugs in a clean, supervised environment with medical staff present. If they overdosed, staff could intervene immediately. In countries like Canada, Switzerland, and Portugal, safe injection sites had been operating for years with remarkable success. They prevented overdose deaths, reduced public drug use, decreased syringe litter, and served as points of contact for people who eventually sought treatment. But in the United States, federal drug laws made them technically illegal, classified as drug trafficking operations. Only a handful opened, most operating in legal grey areas with tacit approval from local governments. The sites proved invaluable during the xylazine crisis. When someone overdosed on tranq dope at a safe injection site, staff could provide immediate respiratory support, monitor vital signs for hours, and prevent death even without a reversal agent. Compare that to someone overdosing alone in a bathroom, not discovered until hours later when intervention is no longer possible. The difference is stark. But funding remained the eternal struggle. Most harm reduction organisations operated on grants from private foundations, small donations, and volunteer labour. Government funding was scarce and politically fraught. Every budget cycle brought uncertainty. Would they have enough money to keep the doors open, to pay staff, to buy supplies? Many organisations ran on passion and fumes, staff working far beyond their paid hours because they couldn't turn people away. The criticism never stopped either. Local politicians denounced harm reduction as enabling addicts. Community members complained about syringe exchange programs attracting drug users to their neighbourhoods, ignoring the fact that users were already there, just using dirty needles. Religious groups argued that harm reduction gave up on salvation, that the only moral response was demanding sobriety and redemption. These critiques, rooted in moralism rather than evidence, made it harder to secure funding and public support. And yet harm reduction persisted, because the people doing the work saw what critics didn't: the lives saved, the infections prevented, the relationships built that eventually led to recovery. They saw users who'd been written off by everyone else, treated like criminals or moral failures, finally encountering someone who saw them as human beings deserving of care. They saw the dignity restored by simple acts: a clean needle, a bandaged wound, a conversation without judgment. Maria, a harm reduction worker in Baltimore, puts it simply: we can't force people to get clean, but we can keep them alive until they're ready. And if they're never ready, we can still offer them humanity, because everyone deserves that, regardless of what substances they use. In the dark days of the xylazine crisis, when hospitals were overwhelmed and police were helpless and politicians were silent, harm reduction stood in the gap. Not with perfect solutions or unlimited resources, just with compassion, pragmatism, and the stubborn belief that every life matters, even lives society has given up on. It wasn't enough to solve the crisis, but it was something, and something saved thousands of lives that would otherwise have been lost. Xylazine didn't enter the drug supply alone, it piggybacked on fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that's been the primary driver of overdose deaths for the past decade. Fentanyl is incredibly potent, cheap to produce, and easy to smuggle. It's also incredibly deadly. Even a tiny miscalculation in dosing can be fatal. When dealers started cutting fentanyl with xylazine, they created a cocktail from hell, an opioid so powerful it could stop your heart, combined with a sedative that made overdoses nearly impossible to reverse. The two drugs amplify each other's effects in unpredictable ways. Fentanyl suppresses breathing, xylazine suppresses breathing and lowers blood pressure and heart rate. Together, they create a perfect storm of respiratory depression and cardiovascular collapse. Paramedics arriving at overdose scenes often found people who were barely breathing, unresponsive to Narcan, and slipping toward death with every passing second. The fentanyl-xylazine combination became the new normal in many parts of the country. It was no longer just a fentanyl crisis, it was a fentanyl-xylazine crisis. And it was deadlier than ever. To understand how we got here, you need to understand fentanyl's rise. In the early 2000s, as crackdowns on prescription, opioids made pills harder to obtain, users turned to heroin. Then Mexican cartels discovered fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that could be manufactured in labs without requiring poppy fields. Fentanyl was cheaper than heroin, easier to produce, and so potent that tiny amounts could be mixed into heroin or pressed into fake pills. The potency was both a selling point and a death sentence. Users got a stronger high, but the margin between intoxication and fatal overdose was razor thin. Fentanyl flooded the market. By 2015, it was showing up in heroin supplies nationwide. By 2017, it had largely replaced heroin in many areas. Users often didn't know they were using fentanyl. They thought they were buying heroin, but what they got was heroin cut with fentanyl, or sometimes just fentanyl dyed and packaged to look like heroin. Overdose deaths skyrocketed. More people died of opioid overdoses in 2017 than died in the entire Vietnam War. Narcan distribution expanded. Public awareness campaigns warned about fentanyl, but the deaths kept climbing. Then xylazine entered the picture, and things got worse. Dealers discovered that mixing xylazine with fentanyl produced a more desirable high. The fentanyl provided the opioid rush, the warm euphoria users craved. The xylazine extended and deepened the sedation, making the high last longer and feel more profound. From a dealer's perspective, it was brilliant. Customers loved it, came back for more and spread the word. From a public health perspective, it was a catastrophe. The pharmacological interaction between fentanyl and xylazine is complex and not fully understood. Both drugs depress the central nervous system, but through different mechanisms. Fentanyl binds to mu-opioid receptors, triggering powerful pain relief and euphoria, while suppressing respiratory drive. Xylazine acts on alpha-2 adrenergic receptors, causing sedation, muscle relaxation, and cardiovascular depression. When used together, the effects don't just add, they multiply. The respiratory depression is more severe, the sedation is deeper, the blood pressure drops lower, and critically, the duration is longer. Fentanyl's effects peak quickly and fade within a few hours. Xylazine lasts much longer, meaning someone can seemingly recover from a fentanyl overdose after Narcan administration, only to slip back into dangerous sedation hours later as the xylazine continues working. This created a new pattern of overdoses. Paramedics would arrive, find someone unconscious and barely breathing, administer Narcan, and watch the person partially revive. Breathing would improve, maybe they'd regain some consciousness. The paramedics would transport them to the hospital, thinking the crisis was over. But then, hours later, the person would deteriorate again as the xylazine's effects persisted without the countering stimulation from opioid withdrawal. Some people died in emergency departments, not from the initial overdose, but from the prolonged xylazine sedation that medical staff didn't fully understand. The combination also made dosing even more unpredictable. Fentanyl alone was already a dosing nightmare. Batches varied wildly in purity and potency. Add xylazine to the mix with its own varying concentrations, and you've created a pharmacological Russian roulette. One bag might be mostly fentanyl with a little xylazine. The next might be the reverse. Users had no way to know. They dosed based on their usual amount, and suddenly they were either underwhelmed or dead. Tolerance patterns changed too. Users who regularly consumed tranq dope developed tolerance to both fentanyl and xylazine. But the tolerances didn't develop at the same rate or in the same ways. Someone might have high opioid tolerance, meaning they needed large doses of fentanyl to feel anything, but low xylazine tolerance, meaning even small amounts caused extreme sedation, or vice versa. This made every use a gamble, even for experienced users who thought they knew their limits. And the wounds, the horrific necrotic wounds associated with xylazine, seemed to worsen in people using the fentanyl-xylazine combination. Researchers theorized that fentanyl's effects on blood flow combined with xylazine's vasoconstriction to create a perfect storm of tissue death. Blood vessels constricted by xylazine, further compromised by fentanyl's systemic effects, simply couldn't deliver enough oxygen to the skin and muscle. Tissue starved of oxygen died, and the wounds spread. The psychological effects were compounded as well. The profound dissociation caused by xylazine mixed with fentanyl's euphoria to create an experience that many users found deeply compelling. They weren't just high, they were absent, erased. Some described it as the closest they'd ever come to not existing, which for people trying to escape trauma or unbearable life circumstances was exactly what they wanted. The drugs didn't just relieve pain or provide pleasure, they offered obliteration. And that was addictive in a way that pure opioids never were. The fentanyl-xylazine crisis represents the intersection of two deadly drug trends, each amplifying the other's worst characteristics. It's synthetic opioids meeting veterinary sedatives. It's pharmaceutical lethality meeting market innovation. It's chemistry without conscience, creating compounds that destroy bodies, erase minds, and kill with unprecedented efficiency. And it's not stopping. Dealers keep cutting, users keep dosing, and paramedics keep finding bodies. The intersection of fentanyl and xylazine isn't just where two drugs meet. It's where America's drug crisis entered a new, deadlier phase. And nobody knows how to reverse course. Xylazine's journey from veterinary clinic to street corner raises uncomfortable questions about supply chains and regulatory oversight. The drug is manufactured by pharmaceutical companies for legitimate veterinary use. Veterinarians order it, stock it, and use it daily. So how does it end up in drug dealers' hands? Sometimes it's stolen. Veterinary clinics are broken into, and xylazine vials disappear. Other times, it's diverted. Someone with access, a vet tech, a supplier, a distributor, sells it under the table, and increasingly it's ordered online from foreign suppliers, shipped in powder form, and repackaged for street sale. The veterinary industry has been slow to respond. Some clinics have tightened security, tracking their xylazine inventory more carefully. But there's no nationwide database, no standardized protocols, and no way to trace diverted drugs back to their source. The FDA regulates xylazine as a veterinary product, not a street drug, and that regulatory gap has allowed the crisis to flourish. It's a classic case of the system failing to adapt to a rapidly changing reality. And until tighter controls are put in place, xylazine will continue to flow from clinics and warehouses into the hands of people who have no business possessing it. Dr. Jennifer Park runs a small animal clinic in rural Pennsylvania. She's been a veterinarian for 15 years, treating everything from cats with ear infections to horses with colic. Xylazine is a standard part of her practice. She uses it almost daily for sedation before procedures. Until recently, she never thought twice about the bottles stored in her locked drug cabinet. Then, in 2021, her clinic was broken into. The thieves ignored the computers, the expensive diagnostic equipment, even the cash box at the front desk. They went straight for the drug cabinet, forcing it open and taking every bottle of xylazine and ketamine they could find. They left everything else untouched. That's when I realised this wasn't random, Dr. Park says. They knew exactly what they wanted. They came for the tranquilizers. The theft wasn't unique. Veterinary clinics across the country reported similar break-ins. In some cases, thieves were sophisticated, bypassing alarm systems and targeting specific medications. In others, they simply smashed windows and grabbed what they could. The common thread was always the same: controlled substances and sedatives, particularly xylazine, were the targets. Law enforcement began connecting the dots, realizing that veterinary clinics had become supply points for the street drug trade. But theft wasn't the only problem. Diversion, the illegal redistribution of legally obtained medications, was even more insidious. Veterinary techs, receptionists, or even veterinarians themselves sometimes sold xylazine to dealers. The temptation was understandable, if not excusable. Xylazine was relatively cheap to order legitimately, a few dollars per vial. On the street, those same vials could sell for hundreds. For someone struggling financially, the math was tempting. Some rationalized it as victimless. The animals weren't being harmed, and they were just meeting market demand. Distributors also played a role. Companies that supplied veterinary clinics with medications sometimes had employees who skimmed inventory, reporting shrinkage or damaged goods while actually selling products on the side. Because xylazine wasn't a controlled substance under DEA regulations, it wasn't tracked as carefully as drugs like ketamine or morphine. Orders didn't require special forms or tracking numbers. A clinic could order large quantities, and as long as they paid the bill, nobody asked questions. Online suppliers created another avenue. Websites based in China, India, or other countries with looser pharmaceutical regulations offered xylazine in bulk powder form. The listings looked semi-legitimate, marketed to research laboratories or veterinary professionals, but anyone with a credit card and a shipping address could order. The powder arrived in nondescript packages, labelled as lab chemicals or research compounds. Customs inspectors had no reason to seize them. Xylazine wasn't illegal to import for research purposes. Only after the packages reached US dealers and got cut into street drugs did they become part of the crisis. The regulatory structure simply wasn't designed for this. The FDA oversees veterinary medications, ensuring they're safe and effective for animals. The DEA oversees controlled substances, tracking drugs with high abuse potential. Xylazine fell into a gap. It was an FDA-regulated veterinary product, but not a DEA-controlled substance. Nobody was specifically responsible for preventing its diversion to human use because nobody imagined it would be used in humans on a large scale. Veterinary associations began sounding alarms. The American Veterinary Medical Association issued guidance to members: secure your xylazine, track your inventory, report thefts immediately. Some state veterinary boards implemented tighter regulations, requiring clinics to maintain detailed logs of xylazine use and storage. But compliance was voluntary and inconsistent. Small rural clinics often lacked the resources to implement sophisticated inventory tracking systems, and even with better security, determined thieves found ways in. Manufacturers felt the pressure too. Companies like Covitrus, Patterson Veterinary, and others that produced and distributed xylazine faced questions about their role in the crisis. Should they limit sales? Require more stringent verification of buyers? Some implemented voluntary restrictions, refusing to sell large quantities to unknown buyers or flagging suspicious orders. But without regulatory mandates, these measures were patchwork at best. The DEA's designation of xylazine as an emerging threat in 2023 brought more attention but limited immediate change. The designation didn't automatically make xylazine a controlled substance or place it under DEA scheduling. That required legislative action. Some lawmakers proposed bills to schedule xylazine, which would subject it to the same tight controls as opioids or other abuse drugs. But veterinarians pushed back, arguing that strict controls would make it harder to access for legitimate medical use, potentially compromising animal care. The debate highlighted the tension between controlling diversion and maintaining access for legitimate purposes. Xylazine is an essential veterinary medication. There's no good substitute for many applications. If regulations became too restrictive, veterinarians would struggle to obtain it, and animals would suffer. But if regulations remained lax, the human toll would continue mounting. Finding the right balance, tight enough to prevent diversion, loose enough to maintain veterinary access, proved maddeningly difficult. Meanwhile, the flow continued. Veterinary clinics reported thefts. Dealers advertised bulk xylazine powder on encrypted messaging apps. Users unknowingly injected medications meant for horses into their veins. And the connection between veterinary supply chains and street corner overdoses remained largely invisible to the public, a hidden pipeline of pharmaceutical diversion that nobody quite knew how to shut down. Dr. Park installed better security cameras and a more sophisticated alarm system after the break-in. She tracks every vial of xylazine meticulously now, recording serial numbers and usage dates. But I know it's not enough, she admits. Somewhere out there, the drugs stolen from my clinic are probably in someone's veins. Maybe they're dead now. Maybe they're suffering from those terrible wounds. And I can't stop thinking, did my carelessness contribute to that? We're trained to help animals, not to think about how our medications might end up killing humans. But here we are. The veterinary connection to the xylazine crisis is a reminder that drug epidemics don't respect boundaries between veterinary and human medicine, between legal and illegal markets, between caring professions and destructive outcomes. The drugs don't care about intention. They just flow from source to user, and everything in between becomes complicit. Behind every statistic is a person. Behind every overdose death is a family left shattered. Meet Sarah, a 32-year-old mother of 2 from Philadelphia. She started using heroin after a back injury led to an opioid prescription. When the pills ran out, she turned to the streets. She didn't know her heroin was cut with xylazine until she woke up one day with a gaping wound on her arm. It wouldn't heal. It kept getting bigger, deeper, more painful. She went to the ER where doctors debrided the dead tissue and sent her home with antibiotics. But she kept using. The wound kept growing. Eventually she lost part of her arm. She's been in and out of rehab trying to stay clean, but the pull of the drug is stronger than her will. Or meet Marcus, a 25-year-old from Baltimore. He overdosed 3 times in 6 months. Each time, paramedics administered Narcan. Each time, it barely worked. He survived, but just barely. His friends weren't so lucky. 2 of them died, slumped over in an alley, their bodies found hours later, cold and stiff. These aren't cautionary tales or moral parables. They're real people, living real nightmares. And there are thousands more just like them, caught in the grip of a drug they didn't ask for and can't escape. Sarah's story begins like so many others, with pain. She was a CNA, a certified nursing assistant, working long shifts at a nursing home. The work was physically demanding, lifting patients, pushing wheelchairs, spending hours on her feet. When she injured her lower back lifting a patient, her doctor prescribed oxycodone for the pain. The pills worked beautifully. Not just for the pain, they made everything feel better. The stress of single motherhood, the exhaustion of working 2 jobs, the loneliness of her ex-husband abandoning them, all of it softened. She started taking more than prescribed. When her doctor cut her off, suspicious of her early refill requests, Sarah panicked. The pain was back, worse than before, but now accompanied by withdrawal symptoms she didn't understand. A co-worker suggested she try heroin. It's the same thing, the co-worker said, just cheaper. Sarah resisted at first. She wasn't a junkie, she told herself. But the pain and the withdrawal became unbearable. She tried it once, just once, to get through a shift. That was 4 years ago. Now she's injecting multiple times daily, no longer to get high, but just to avoid being sick. And somewhere along the way, her heroin became tranq dope. The wound appeared on her left forearm, a small discoloured patch she initially thought was a bruise. Within days, it had opened into an ulcer. Within weeks, it was the size of a golf ball, oozing and foul-smelling. She went to the ER only when the pain became too intense to ignore. The doctor who treated her was kind, didn't lecture her about drug use, just cleaned the wound and prescribed antibiotics. He warned her that if she didn't stop using, the wound would never heal. She nodded, meaning to quit, really meaning it. But the withdrawal symptoms started before she even left the hospital. By evening, she was using again. The wound grew. It exposed muscle, then tendon. Sarah could see the structures inside her arm moving when she flexed her fingers, a horrifying glimpse of her own anatomy. The infection spread. Debridement became weekly, then twice weekly. Surgeons cut away dead tissue until there was almost nothing left. Finally, they told her the truth. The arm couldn't be saved. The infection had reached the bone. Without amputation, sepsis would kill her. She woke up from surgery missing her left arm from just below the elbow. She was 31 years old. Her children, aged 7 and 5, visited her in the hospital and cried when they saw the bandaged stump. She told them Mommy had been sick, that the doctors had to remove part of her arm to make her better. She didn't mention the drugs, the necrotic wounds, the xylazine that she still didn't fully understand. She just held them with her remaining arm and promised to be better, to do better. That was 6 months ago. Since then, Sarah has been in rehab twice. The first time, she left after 3 days, unable to tolerate the withdrawal symptoms. The second time, she made it 2 weeks before relapsing within hours of discharge. She's currently back on the streets, one-armed and still using, because the addiction is stronger than shame, stronger than fear, stronger than love for her children. She knows she's dying. The wounds have appeared elsewhere now, on her leg, her torso. Her body is destroying itself from the inside out, but she can't stop. Marcus's story is different but parallel. He was a college student, a sophomore at Morgan State University studying computer science. Smart, ambitious, popular. He started using pills recreationally at parties, just Xanax at first, then Percocet, then whatever was available. When a friend suggested they try heroin, Marcus was hesitant but curious. That curiosity cost him everything. Within a year, he dropped out of school, estranged from his family, living in a friend's basement and selling his belongings to fund his addiction. The first overdose happened in a gas station bathroom. He was alone, slumped against the toilet, not breathing. A customer found him and called 911. Paramedics gave him Narcan. He came to slowly, confused and angry, and refused transport to the hospital. The second overdose was at a bus stop witnessed by dozens of commuters. Again, Narcan, revival, refusal of treatment. The third time, he was with friends. They called 911 immediately when he stopped breathing. This time, the paramedics gave him multiple doses of Narcan with minimal effect. They bagged him manually, breathing for him, all the way to the hospital. He survived, but barely. Marcus's two friends who overdosed with him that night didn't make it. One was dead before paramedics arrived. The other died in the ambulance despite aggressive intervention. Marcus attended their funerals sitting in the back, unable to face their families, consumed by guilt and grief. He swore he'd quit. He meant it. But 3 days later, he was using again, because the physical and psychological grip of addiction was stronger than his will, stronger than his fear of death. Now Marcus is 25, looks 40, and lives day to day. He's homeless, staying in shelters when he can get a bed, sleeping rough when he can't. His parents won't talk to him anymore. They've been burned too many times by broken promises and stolen money. He has scars on both arms from the wounds, though his haven't been as severe as Sarah's. He's been arrested twice for minor possession charges, spent a few weeks in jail, and went right back to using upon release. These stories repeat endlessly, with minor variations across America. Different names, different cities, different details, but the same arc. Pain or curiosity leading to use leading to addiction leading to xylazine exposure, xylazine leading to wounds and overdoses and destroyed lives. Some people die, some people lose limbs, some people survive physically but lose everything else: family, jobs, homes, dignity, hope. And the tragedy is that most of these people never chose xylazine. They chose heroin, or what they thought was heroin. The xylazine was thrust upon them, mixed in by dealers they'd never met, as part of a supply chain they didn't understand. They became victims of a crisis they didn't know existed, and now they carry the scars, physical, psychological, social, of a drug that was never meant for humans. Sarah, one-armed and still using. Marcus, haunted by the faces of dead friends. And thousands more like them, living nightmares written in necrotic flesh and lost time, searching for relief that never comes and always costs more than they can afford to pay. So here we are at the end of our journey through one of America's darkest and most misunderstood drug crises. You've learned about xylazine, a veterinary sedative that was never meant for humans, now saturating the drug supply and destroying lives in ways we're only beginning to comprehend. You've seen the zombie lean, the necrotic wounds that eat flesh while people are still alive, the overdoses that Narcan can't reverse. You've met Sarah, who lost her arm, Marcus, who lost his friends, and thousands more whose names you'll never know but whose suffering is just as real, just as devastating. The xylazine crisis is a horror story written in pharmaceutical chemistry and human desperation. Its horse tranquilizers in human veins, its wounds that look like medieval plagues, It's people frozen on street corners, bent at impossible angles, trapped between consciousness and oblivion while the world walks past. It's paramedics arriving at overdose scenes with the one tool that saved thousands of lives, only to watch it fail. It's families burying children who never meant to become addicts, who just wanted relief from pain and found annihilation instead. But this crisis is also a mirror, reflecting back the failures of our systems, our policies, and our collective compassion. It shows us what happens when we treat addiction as a moral failing instead of a medical condition, when we fund prisons instead of treatment centres, when we criminalise the vulnerable and ignore their suffering until it becomes too visible to deny, when we let profit-driven drug markets operate unchecked while defunding the public health infrastructure that could protect people, when we turn away from the uncomfortable truth that the person slumped on that street corner is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend, someone who matters. The people suffering through the xylazine crisis didn't choose this drug. Most didn't even know they were taking it. They chose heroin or fentanyl substances. They understood, and the market gave them a bonus ingredient that would rot their flesh and complicate their overdoses and trap them in a deeper, darker addiction than they'd ever imagined. They became test subjects in an uncontrolled experiment, guinea pigs for a substance that was never studied in humans, never approved for human use, never meant to touch human tissue. And yet, for all the horror, there's also resilience. There are the harm reduction workers standing in the gap, distributing clean needles and wound care supplies and compassion to people everyone else has given up on. There are the nurses and doctors spending hours debriding wounds and teaching care techniques and seeing humanity where society sees only zombies. There are the survivors, people like Marcus, 2 months clean and fighting every day to stay that way. People like the thousands we didn't name who wake up each morning and choose not to use, even though the pull is overwhelming and the world offers little support for that choice. There are also lessons if we're willing to learn them. The xylazine crisis teaches us that drug markets evolve faster than policy can respond. That prohibition creates opportunities for dangerous adulterants. That harm reduction saves lives, even when it doesn't require abstinence. That treatment needs to be accessible, affordable, and evidence-based. That housing, healthcare, and social support aren't luxuries, they're necessities that keep people alive long enough to recover. That punishment doesn't cure addiction, but compassion might give people a chance. Portugal proved it's possible to take a different approach. Canada's doing it, imperfectly, but genuinely. Switzerland did it decades ago. The evidence is clear. Treat addiction as a health issue. Invest in treatment and harm reduction. Decriminalize use, and the outcomes improve. Overdoses decrease. Infections drop. People recover. It's not perfect, but it's better than what we're doing now, which is watching people die while wringing our hands about tough-on-crime policies that have never worked and never will. The xylazine crisis isn't over. If anything, it's accelerating. Xylazine continues spreading across the country and around the world. New adulterants are probably already in the pipeline, being mixed into drug supplies by dealers who don't know and don't care what they're creating. The next crisis is coming, and after that, another one. Because as long as we maintain the same broken systems, the same punitive policies, the same stigma and neglect, these crises will keep emerging. Different drugs, same pattern, different names, same tragedy. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can choose differently. We can fund treatment instead of incarceration. We can support harm reduction instead of demonizing it. We can see people with addiction as human beings deserving of care instead of criminals deserving of punishment. We can learn from countries that have done this better than we have. We can acknowledge that the war on drugs has failed catastrophically and try something new, something based on evidence and compassion, rather than ideology and fear. Will we? That's the question that keeps harm reduction workers up at night, that haunts the doctors treating wounds that shouldn't exist, that echoes in the minds of parents who've buried children too young. Will we change? Will we learn? Will we do better? Or will we keep doing the same things, hoping for different results, while more people die, more families shatter, more communities collapse under the weight of drugs that flow endlessly, because we've created the perfect conditions for them to flourish? Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your safe, warm bed, maybe think about the people who won't sleep tonight. The ones bent over on cold sidewalks, trapped in trank-induced stupors, waiting for the drug to wear off so they can find their next dose and start the cycle again. The ones lying in hospital, beds with wounds being debrided, screaming through the pain. The ones in early recovery, fighting cravings and withdrawal and the overwhelming urge to give up. The families sitting in living rooms, staring at empty chairs, wondering what they could have done differently. Think about them. Remember them. Because they're not statistics or moral lessons or cautionary tales. They're people. They're us. Any one of us could be one prescription, one injury, one bad decision away from walking their path. The line between normal person and addict is far thinner than we'd like to believe. And until we recognize that, until we extend the same compassion we'd want for ourselves or our loved ones, the crisis will continue. The horse tranquilizer crisis, the zombie drug epidemic, the xylazine nightmare, whatever you call it, it's real, it's deadly, and it's not going away on its own. But maybe, just maybe, if we face it with honesty, compassion, and the will to change, we can turn the tide. Not tomorrow, not easily, but eventually. One life saved, one person housed, one wound healed, one moment of dignity restored to someone the world had written off. That's where hope lives in this crisis, not in grand solutions or perfect policies, but in the small, stubborn acts of care that happen every day in harm reduction clinics and hospital wound care centres and recovery meetings, in every person who chooses to help instead of judge, in every policymaker who chooses evidence over ideology, in every community that chooses compassion over criminalization. The crisis is dark, but humans are stubborn. We survive, we adapt, we care for each other, even when it's hard, even when the systems fail us. And sometimes that's enough, not to end the crisis, but to save one more life, and then another, and another. So sleep well tonight, and when you wake up tomorrow, maybe remember what you learned. Remember the people trapped in this nightmare, and if you have the power, through your vote, your voice, your work, your donations, your advocacy, to make things even slightly better, consider using it. Because every bit helps, every life matters, even the ones society has decided don't. The horse tranquilizer won this round, but the fight isn't over. And as long as people like the harm reduction workers in Kensington, the nurses debriding wounds, the survivors staying clean one day at a time, and the families refusing to give up on their loved ones, as long as they keep fighting, there's hope. Stubborn, complicated, imperfect hope. But hope nonetheless. Good night. Sleep peacefully. And maybe tomorrow we'll all try to be a little kinder, a little more compassionate, a little more willing to see the humanity in people society has labelled as zombies. Because they're not zombies. They never were. They're people. And they deserve better than what we've given them. Sweet dreams.